Mother 2, or as we in the great nation of Eagleland call it, EarthBound, is a quirky mid-90s JRPG for the SNES that went against the grain of more traditional fantasy RPGs of the time. It tells the story of a young boy on a globe-trotting journey to stop the impending return of the evil alien invader Gygus. EarthBound originally released as Mother 2 in Japan on August 27, 1994, 30 years ago to this day. While the series has remained relatively stagnant since the Japanese exclusive Mother 3 in 2006, its fanbase has only grown over the last 3 decades. Without much in the way of official Mother series projects, I wanted to celebrate this milestone in the only way I know how. What's up, you little gamers? I'm Kagly, and welcome to my channel, where I remake classic levels and assets from my favorite games using modern tools and techniques. Over the course of 2023, I remade several areas from Banjo-Kazooie, making sort of video diaries about the process. In making these videos, I learned a lot about 3D art, and more importantly, improved as an artist. But after my Freeze Easy Peak video, I wanted to challenge myself, step outside of my comfort zone, and take on a project unlike anything I've done before. What you're about to see is the culmination of that goal, so please enjoy.
僕ですか?
What you just saw was my take on an EarthBound remake, featuring surprise appearances from Ness and a colorful cast of NPCs and critters, all lovingly remade in 3D. This was probably the most challenging remake project I've ever taken on, as every aspect of this world had to be carefully thought through and handcrafted, from the landscape to the placement and perspective of each individual asset. There's a lot to unpack, but first I'd like to thank my friend Wannabe Composer 64 for his arrangement of some of EarthBound's iconic music. I could not have made this video without his contributions, and you can listen to the full arrangements on his channel, which is in the description. I highly recommend that you check out his channel. He's got a ton of arrangements from games like Sam & Max, Banjo-Kazooie, Super Mario RPG, and Donkey Kong 64, as well as some fantastic original work. Before we jump into the showcase portion of this video, consider liking the video, subscribe for more videos like it, and hit the bell to be notified when I upload. With all that said, let's take a trip to the town of Onett and see what this small town has to offer. This remake covers the entirety of Onett, as well as several key scenes from the beginning of EarthBound. In this showcase segment, I'll exhibit several key areas around town and take a closer look at some of those memorable moments. EarthBound's adventure begins at Ness's house, and so it feels like a good place to start. Already we can see a bit of the design philosophy I employed when remaking EarthBound's world. This project was heavily inspired by the recent Super Mario RPG remake, which lovingly brought the pre-rendered aesthetics of the original game to life on Nintendo Switch. EarthBound, by contrast, is quite a bit more simplistic in visual style. By the time the game released in the West, we already had games like Donkey Kong Country 1 and 2, Super Metroid, Final Fantasy VI, Chrono Trigger, and Star Fox pushing the boundaries of what games could look like on SNES. Meanwhile, EarthBound leans more heavily into a stylized simplicity. This simplicity is something I wanted to retain in this remake. I just don't think a more realistic and textured environment would have fit EarthBound's signature style, so you'll notice that I kept things relatively simple with small details making the environments pop. Take a look at the grass for instance. I'd experimented with using the same shader-based grass as my Banjo remakes here, but I eventually opted to keep it relatively monochromatic, with darker clumps of grass scattered around just like in the original game. As for Ness's house itself, I tried to make the model as close as possible to the original game, and a big part of that, as well as with any house or building in Onett, is perspective. I'll get more into how I achieved the unique 2D perspective EarthBound is drawn with later on in the breakdown section, but for now, just know that a lot of thought was put into not only how things look in this remake, but also how the camera works to present it all to the player. For this remake, I had to model some interiors as well, so let's take a look at the inside of Ness's house in more detail. Home sweet home. Here we can see a few of the characters that I remade for this project, including Ness's family dog King, a fitting name if I do say so myself. One of my favorite parts of making interiors for this remake project was having more control over the lighting. Unlike the outdoor scenes, which largely utilize one directional light, I have access to virtually unlimited point and spotlights that can be placed in any configuration, allowing for different moods for daytime and nighttime. Back outside, we can make our way next door to see the Minch household, home to Ness's childhood rival Porky and his little brother Picky. It doesn't look like anyone's home, and I didn't end up modeling the interior of the Minch house, so we can just move along from here. Before we make our way to Onett's urban district, there are a few key areas I wanted to show off. Firstly, here's the neighborhood treehouse. For some reason, this is one of the landmarks that sticks in my mind the most when thinking about Onett, even though it doesn't really have all that much of an impact on the game as a whole. Next, I'd like to show you one of my favorite parts of town. On the surface, this house seems unassuming, but entering the home of Liar Exaggerate tells a very different story. Liar is an explorer known for stretching the truth a bit, but I gotta say, I respect the dedication it takes to dig a mine in your own house. This is such a shining example of EarthBound's unique sense of humor, and I had to include it in this remake. As we make our way to the top of this hilly part of town, we approach probably the most important moment of the beginning of EarthBound, the inciting incident that sends Ness on his journey, the arrival of the time-traveling stag beetle Buzz, and the warning of the return of the evil alien invader Gygus. In the original game, Ness and Porky investigate a meteor crash in the dead of night when searching for Porky's younger brother Picky, and are thrown into the plot by a small stag beetle from the future. This event and the subsequent battle with Gygus is also time-traveling minion Starman Jr. are some of the most memorable moments of the original game, and I really wanted to nail these moments for this remake. The first time you investigate this meteor crash, the scene is heavily guarded by police officers, and I remade this segment as well, complete with blue and red police lights illuminating the nighttime shadows. As for the encounters with Buzz and Starman Jr., I took heavy inspiration from Super Mario RPG. You see, for certain enemy encounters and important moments, the game breaks away from the bounds of the original game, inserting more detailed pre-rendered cutscenes. I decided to implement these kinds of scenes into my EarthBound remake as well. Speaking of battles, there's another huge aspect of the original game that I wanted to incorporate into this remake one way or another. Battles in EarthBound follow a pretty simple visual template. Each enemy has its own unique and trippy background, as well as a single-frame sprite with the battle UI overlaid on top. It's pretty to the point, and I think that's part of the charm of EarthBound. More importantly in this context, it gave me a really nice and easy template to work from, and a lot of room for small improvements. In the remake, most of the original battle screen is intact, with small improvements and cues from Mother 3. The battle backgrounds remain pretty much unchanged. They're such an integral part of EarthBound's visual identity, and they still look great to this day. The single-frame enemy sprites, however, have been updated to animated 3D models. In keeping with EarthBound's simplicity, I opted for minimal stop-motion idle animations. Nothing too fancy, but enough to make the effort in remaking these sprites worth it. As for the battle UI, this is where I took a note from Mother 3. In that game, each member of your party has their own unique battle sprite, where their head sort of peeks over the bottom text window. I really like this touch, and I think it would fit in an official Mother 2 remake as well. Battles in my EarthBound remake look very similar on the surface, but when you take a closer look, I hope you can see the work on display. With the prologue of the game out of the way, we can finally make our way to the greater Onett metropolitan area. While Onett may not be a major metropolis like Fourside, it does have a lot to offer. Oh boy, I'm kinda getting hungry. I'm not too worried though, as Onett is home to one of the finest burger shops this side of Tucson, and I hear Threed's very own Mock Pizza is opening a location here as well. Here's the interior of Onett's burger shop. I'll be right back. This is so freaking good. Okay, next up on the docket is Onett's historical town hall, headquarters to Mayor B.H. Perkle, whose plan to wipe out the town's local gang, the Sharks, involves bribing a 10-year-old to beat up the gang's leader, and that's frankly the initiative this town needs. We'll get to the Sharks soon enough, but in the meantime, let's take a look at Onett's esteemed police department, led by Captain Strong. Between mysterious meteorite crashes and the town's shark problem, Onett's finest always have something to do. Unfortunately, they also have a habit of beating up the neighborhood kids when they poke around where they don't belong, and have set up a barricade on the south side of town, barring travel to the neighboring town of Tucson. Moving right along, Onett is home to many more buildings, as towns often are, including a local bakery, hospital, and hotel. If scenic walks and majestic views are more your thing, making our way to the west side of town brings us to the picturesque Beak Point. Gaze at the majesty of the Eagle Land oceanside and be soothed by the sweet song of the trumpet guy. Ah yeah, that's the stuff. I've been trying to avoid Onett's south side, but I suppose the time has come to face the town's gang problem head on. Yeah, the south side of town is teeming with members of the local street gang, the Sharks, led by the slick and scheming Frank Fly. The Sharks have taken over the local arcade, and Frank Fly runs the show from the arcade's backyard. Lastly, just north of town is the Traveling Performers Shack, which, after being ransacked by the Sharks, was locked down by the Onett PD. Very unfortunate for the traveling performers, but even more unfortunate for Ness, as the shack is the only way to get to Giant Step. Giant Step is Onett's final area, guarded by a mysterious creature. Can Ness take down Frank Fly? Will he reach Giant Step? And what lies beyond the path to Tucson? Well, that's a story for a different day. As for Onett itself, there's still so much to do, so many characters to talk to, so many places to visit, and Onett is just the beginning. Consider this video just a slice of what a full EarthBound remake could look like, as the original game spans multiple cities, countries, continents, and even dimensions. EarthBound is a truly special game, and Onett serves as the perfect introduction to this game's world, and it was an incredible experience remaking it for this. So that's my take on an EarthBound remake, featuring the game's most iconic town. What you just saw was the culmination of about 5 months of work, and it's something that I've always wanted to do. For the remainder of this video, I'm going to talk about how it all came together, the creative decisions that I had to make, and how that all differed from previous remake projects. So if that sounds like your thing, stick around, grab a snack, grab a drink, take a freaking load off. You know, you've been working so hard, you've earned it. Like I said before, this project was without a doubt the most challenging remake I've ever taken on. It challenged me in ways that I expected, but also in ways that I didn't expect at all. I had to make hard decisions that guided the entirety of the project, and the process was like nothing I've done before. First of all, my previous Banjo-Kazooie remakes were all put together in Unity. I wanted to build these levels in an actual game engine to give them a level of authenticity and fidelity, using actual tools that a game studio might in a real remake, while also opening up the possibility to add gameplay elements down the line. That's the philosophy I went into this remake with, and I had planned on incorporating actual gameplay from the beginning of this EarthBound project. However, as I'll explain in a bit, things didn't quite work out the way that I expected, and I've got something to admit. Everything you've been looking at over the course of this video has been pre-rendered. None of it is running in an actual game engine. Instead of creating 3D assets in Blender and bringing them into a game engine like Unity, I used Blender entirely. This was not an easy decision, and it led to its own unique set of challenges, but I think I made the right decision in the long run. Blender offered me a lot more flexibility when it came to creating shaders and animations, the workflow was a lot faster, and the level just looked a lot better in Blender. I did do my best to keep this remake as authentic as possible, as if it were a real game in a real game engine. For instance, I used Blender's real-time render engine Eevee. See, Blender has two main render engines, Cycles and Eevee. Cycles is a highly accurate and high-quality path tracing render engine. When you know how to use it, Cycles renders can look amazing and highly realistic. Cycles is capable of pumping out renders on par with modern animated films and visual effects. It uses physically accurate light calculations and emulates the way that light paths bounce around spaces in the real world, hence the term path tracing. The only real drawback to using Cycles is that even with a big old beefy RTX GPU, rendering animations with Cycles can be a very long process, with detailed high-quality animation renders taking upwards of days to complete. Plus, even with the advent of real-time ray tracing GPUs, it would be hard to pass off Cycles renders as anywhere close to what a Nintendo game might look like. Eevee, on the other hand, is Blender's real-time render engine. Eevee resembles the graphical capabilities of a game engine a lot more closely, using more traditional rasterization techniques. I also kept polygon counts and texture resolution in check when creating assets for this project. Any characters, buildings, or props modeled for this project are relatively low poly and would fit nicely into an actual game engine. So you might be asking, why not just use a game engine for this? After all of my previous Banjo-Kazooie remake videos were made in Unity. So why try so hard to emulate the look of game engines while technically pre-rendering everything? Well, to explain that, I figured I'd start at the beginning of the project. By doing so, you'll kind of get an idea of my headspace and the decisions that I had to make to bring this project to life. So let's go back, way back to April of this year when I really started working on this video. Before I began active production on this remake, I wanted to make sure that I had a solid game plan going in. I made some goals that I wanted to achieve with this project, as well as some notable observations of the original game. First of all, I knew I wanted to cover Onett in its entirety. I was keenly aware that this was a pretty massive undertaking, as the town is not only fairly large, but also would require a bit of creativity when translating the 2D map to a 3D environment. I also figured that this town would feel relatively empty without a good number of enemies and NPCs, so I knew I had to make more character models than I'd ever done for a remake. I also knew that I wanted to incorporate gameplay of some sort. It's always been something that I wanted to include in a remake video, and I figured that the relatively simple top-down gameplay of EarthBound would be a good place to start. Plus, I could throw in a bit of variety by recreating some of the game's early battles. At the time, I assumed most of this would be done in Unity. Keep that in mind. With these goals in mind, I began to experiment a bit, attempting to solve a problem that came up pretty early. You see, one of the key aspects of EarthBound's visual style, at least in Onett, is the perspective that houses, buildings, and roads are all drawn with. Onett's buildings aren't purely drawn from the top down, nor are they drawn at an isometric angle. No, Onett uses a type of orthographic projection called oblique projection. With oblique projection, the front face of an object is drawn flat, and the top and sides are drawn at a given angle. This is totally fine in 2D and lends EarthBound a unique sort of look. Unfortunately, this type of projection is very difficult to implement in 3D. There's no easy way to automatically project a scene using oblique projection in the same way you can do with perspective, orthographic, and isometric projection. After a bit of tinkering and a lot of chin scratching, I came up with an elegant solution. Fake it. Oftentimes when adapting 2D representation to a 3D scene, artists have to think outside of the box. Take Nintendo's own game, The Legend of Zelda: A Link Between Worlds, for example. This game adapts the style and world of A Link to the Past, this time in a 3D engine for the 3DS. With the game's 3D camera, developers noticed how difficult it was to parse what Link was doing when they were mostly looking at the top of his head, and items were hard to identify for the same reason. So they simply rotated every character, enemy, and item away from the camera. This made the game a lot more legible, and the models were more reminiscent of A Link to the Past sprites. So if Nintendo can cheese perspective with tricks like this, by God, so can I. So in Blender, I set the camera up with an orthographic perspective, which I knew I could do in Unity as well, and rotated it at a 45-degree angle, so the scene had sort of a semi-isometric camera setup. As a quick tangent, one of the advantages of remaking levels from the Nintendo 64 era, like with my Banjo videos, is that you have actual 3D geometry to work off of. The first step I take in those remakes is to extract any given level's geometry and import it straight into Blender, so I have a reference for proportions and form. 2D games like EarthBound, on the other hand, have little to no 3D geometry to refer to, so creative steps had to be taken to make sure that this area was accurate to the original game. Here's a basic rundown of how the process worked. I nabbed this map of the town from the Spriters Resource, an archive website with thousands of sprites from hundreds of games. If you're at all interested in the assets that make up your favorite games, I'd highly recommend browsing this site as well as the other sites in the VG Resource network. I imported this map of Onett into Blender as an image plane and set my camera up at a 45-degree angle with orthographic projection. You may notice that this angle squashes the map a little bit, so I scaled the plane up on the y-axis until it looked about right, with all individual pixels as square as I could get them. The next step was to pick a building. I wanted to start with the downtown area, as it's vertically the lowest point in town and the most dense. I knew that the actual landscape surrounding the town would be the most difficult aspect of this remake, as translating verticality in 2D to a 3D space is probably the hardest thing a human being can do. So I picked the pizzeria to start with, as the general shape and facade of this building could be repeated several times in other buildings, and aspects of this building could be reused for building templates. From a 45-degree or 3/4 perspective, I added a singular vertex at the bottom corner of the building according to my reference image. I then extruded this vertex along the x-axis, reaching the other bottom corner, then extruded my new edge along the x and y-axes until they reached the back corners of the building. Then I extruded this new face along the z-axis until it reached the top of the building. Already, I've blocked out the simple shape of this building with oblique projection, at least from the locked camera perspective. If you look at the model from any other angle, you can sort of see the trick here. It's a very thin rhombic prism, but it works and translates the oblique effect from the original game. Back in that 3/4 orthographic perspective, I was able to add details to this simple blockout. For instance, to smooth out the corners of this building, I selected the outer edges of the prism and beveled them, adding some geometry along the corners. Beveling is one of my favorite ways to soften hard surface models and add a bit of realism or stylization to hard edges. I also extruded the top face up and outward, adding a sort of crown to this building, insetting this face and extruding down to create the roof. I also created these storefront windows by adding loop cuts and extruding inwards towards the X and Y axes, keeping with the same oblique angle as the rest of the model. I used the same oblique projection technique to create the upper floor windows and a flower planter thing in the front of the store. With the modeling process pretty much done, I created some stylized materials using textures I grabbed from FreePBR.com, using color mix nodes to finely tune the materials' colors to match the original game. Yay, we finished the building! Wait, we still have the entire rest of the town to do. Dang. Well, thankfully the drugstore and bakery share the exact same design, so those models can just be duplicates of the pizzeria, with minor tweaks here and there and some new materials with different color values. That wasn't so bad, and to be honest, most of the buildings in town are fairly similar as well. I was able to reuse several components like windows and doors between buildings, plus the technique for modeling these buildings is fairly straightforward. There were a few unique cases such as the police station or town hall, but I was able to get most of the buildings and houses done within a reasonable amount of time. What came next, however, wasn't so simple. Modeling the landscape was a definite challenge, and the solution I came to, I'll admit, wasn't ideal. Typically with these projects, I have strict geometry to reference when making terrain or landscapes. The usual technique tends to result in fairly clean geometry, but I was basically freehanding a lot of the terrain here. Sure, I had the 2D map of town to work from, but especially as I got towards the northern end of town, I had to make a lot of guesses and basically fight for my life when dealing with verticality and cliffs and whatnot. So, all that to say, what you're about to see is very likely not the ideal way of doing things. This is not best practices, not a tutorial, it's gonna get ugly. So, I started from Beak Point, the lookout point on the western edge of town, placed a vertex on the very corner of the map, and traced the edge of the grass all the way around the map. When I got to a cliff, I would duplicate the vertices on the bottom of the cliff face and translate them up on the z-axis until they hit the top of the cliff face. I essentially traced the edges until I had an outline of the whole town's terrain, with extra brainpower going towards figuring out the angle on this slope right here and the walk up to the impact site from the beginning of the game. Once I had this rough outline, I created faces connecting them all together. These are what we call n-gons, or polygons with more than 4 vertices, and they're typically considered to be a big no-no when making game assets. They're more of a temporary way to make faces before retopologizing or triangulating your faces, which was my next step. I triangulated all of these n-gons and ended up with a veritable spiderweb of geometry. As I wiped sweat from my brow and snapped out of the fugue state that I'd been in when modeling this terrain, I realized I was in a pretty big pickle. See, the technique I've used in the past to smoothly blend between terrain and grass textures called vertex painting doesn't really work that well with chaotic triangulated geometry like this. In the foggy, nightmarish haze of modeling the terrain, I failed to account for that, and I needed a lifeline. That's where Blender's Quadraflow Remesh came in. Quadraflow essentially automatically retopologizes your geometry into clean quad-based topology. And with that, I was left with much cleaner and more dense topology to work with. Quadraflow can get a little wonky, so there was a little bit of troubleshooting with the settings and also just sort of cleaning up the model after, but I think it got the job done pretty well. With the town's terrain modeled, I set about the task of vertex painting before finishing up with the remaining houses, buildings, streets, paths, and foliage. I designated the red channel to cliffs and the green channel to grass. This would become useful later in Unity, but I'll get into that whole ordeal later. Back to the main course, I felt that the town was missing quite a bit of life and vibrancy, and that was due to the lack of foliage or vegetation. So I created a simple grass mesh and instanced a bunch of grass along the landscape using Blender's hair particle system. Nice! Then I created a few variations of tree models using custom base color and normal maps I created in a separate Blender file. Basically, I made a leaf model and copied it around in a circular shape, then generated a normal map based on that model, and made a simple color variation material for the leaves and rendered a grayscale based texture for brightness variation. Back to the tree model, I modeled the tree trunk from the same 45-degree perspective as everything else, and placed several hemispheres at the top of the trunk. Moving the camera around, we can see that it very much places that 3/4 overhead camera perspective, much like the buildings before. I multiplied the grayscale texture I made earlier with a minty green RGB value, which resulted in some nicely varied leaves. For a bit more variation, I duplicated these hemispheres and scaled them along their normals, and added a more sparse texture set for some more layering. I repeated the process for a second variation, as well as a few medium and large trees. Then came the task of placing the trees around the scene, which couldn't really be done as randomly as the grass, as each tree in Onett has its own specific place and purpose, and I wouldn't want to fight against nature. So I referred to the map, duplicated and placed each individual tree, making sure to use my model variants accordingly. I did the same with some flower models, and the vegetation was done. But it was feeling a little stagnant, so later on, after I switched to Blender, which I'll get into in a bit, I added a subtle wiggle expression driver to the UV rotation coordinates, giving the effect of leaves wiggling in the wind. It's not super detailed, but it's pretty effective in my opinion. After all that foliage, I went about creating the models for the remaining buildings, houses, roads, and small details around town, such as the meteorite at the top of the hill, giant step, and the water surrounding Beak Point. That's a custom water material I made after the switch to Blender. In fact, I guess it's time to go into all of that. Usually when making remakes on this channel, I like to start in Unity as early as possible, creating the basic terrain in Blender first, then building the rest of the scene within Unity using models I make separately in Blender. It's a lot of back and forth, but the workflow works for me. This time, however, I opted to build most of the level in Blender and worry about Unity later. So when it came time to import this massive file into Unity, things went downhill pretty fast. Getting Unity's HD render pipeline to play nice with stylized art direction isn't the easiest task in the first place, but after a lot of messing with lighting settings, I got a pretty solid looking scene together, and was able to set up materials in a few days. That might sound like a long time to set up materials in the Unity scene, and it is, but I'm working a full-time job on top of all this, so cut me some slack. I used a layered shader to mix grass and cliff textures via vertex painting like I mentioned before, and just like that, the scene was pretty much ported. One other thing, I originally planned to use the same grass shader that I used in my Banjo remakes, but I had a few hiccups that eventually led to the whole Unity project being scrapped. First of all, I was using a newer version of Unity that I guess wasn't compatible with the version of the shader I had, so I had to resort to an earlier version of Unity. I duplicated the terrain texture in Blender, changed some of the vertex colors to work with the grass shader, and plugged it all back into Unity, and it was looking pretty rough. It took a lot of time to tweak it enough to look passable, but I wasn't exactly happy with the way the Unity version of the project looked. This isn't necessarily the engine's fault, but it wasn't what I had in mind going in. Like I mentioned at the beginning of the breakdown, I originally planned to have gameplay of some sort from the very beginning of the project, and for that I started to program Ness's basic movement. This was before I even had a model for Ness made, mind you. Things kinda came to a head from there. It was late May, and I felt like that gif of Gromit frantically laying planks in front of him while barreling down a train track. I was in way over my head and trying to take on the role of an artist, programmer, and content creator, and on top of that, it looked so much better in Blender. The Blender version of the scene was bright and lively, a heavy contrast to the muddy and gloomy look of the Unity version. So I made the tough decision to scrap the last few weeks of work entirely and just switch to Blender. This would mean sacrificing authentic gameplay, but I think I made the right choice. Could I have tweaked the scene enough to look better in Unity? Maybe, but ultimately my workflow improved significantly when I switched to Blender, and I wouldn't do anything different in retrospect. This also came with a bit of a shift in how I approached this project. If authentic gameplay is out of the picture, how do I present this project as a remake? Can I get away with faking gameplay footage on such a scale? Yeah, why not? None of this is real. I'm not actually delivering a playable EarthBound remake at the end of the day, so the way in which I present it doesn't really matter as much. So long as it looks somewhat believable, I suppose. Plus, I always wanted to offer my Blender project files on Patreon anyway, and this way, what you see is pretty much what you get. It also meant that I could cut the work involved by a significant margin, and really focus on what's important to show. Rather than modeling and programming anything and everything, I could focus on a select number of locales and characters to show off. So how did that process work? How did I decide what to show and when? How did I fake gameplay you saw in the earlier trailer segment? Pretty soon after making the decision to cut my losses with Unity and go Blender or bust, I cut together a rough version of the trailer from the beginning of the video, using actual gameplay of EarthBound, making sure to weave a bit of a narrative with the footage, and showcase a good number of memorable characters and locations. I also made sure to include a few battle segments, which I'll get into in a bit. With this rough cut of the trailer, I had a direct reference for how much I needed to create and how it all looked in game. So I went about creating a few characters that show up in the trailer. First and foremost is the game's protagonist, Ness. I used a pretty simple box modeling technique for all the characters in this video, and I tried to keep them relatively simple in shape and form. This is due in large part to evoke the clay models used in the original game's marketing and development. Speaking of those clay models, the original models from the early 90s have actually been on display at the Secrets of Mother 2 exhibit in celebration of the game's 30th anniversary at Shibuya's Hobonichi store since the beginning of August. Did you get a chance to see these in person? If you did, definitely leave a comment, I'd love to hear about it. I won't go into too much detail on how the exact modeling methods worked here. This video is getting pretty long anyway, and I'm still kind of a rookie when it comes to character modeling. It was definitely one of my weak spots going into this project, and I actually made so many characters for this project that I'm a lot more confident now than I was before. But I am still a rookie, and a lot of these models have some issues with topology and armature skinning. After finishing the base model for any given character, I would export them as an FBX file and import them into Substance Painter for texturing, using lots of fill layers and geometry masks, with paint layers serving for details like blush, ear shading, and creases on clothes. I made sure to sample my base color layers from the original game to keep the characters as accurate as possible in this phase. Ness is definitely the most detailed in this regard, with stitching on his shorts and seams on his shirt and hat. From Substance Painter, I would export the textures into my project folder and load them up in Blender using the shader editor. Next came the process of rigging and armature skinning, essentially making a skeleton for the characters in order to later animate them. This is something I've always struggled with, but aside from some wacky weight painting here or there, I'd say I did pretty okay in this regard. If you're a Patreon member and want to drag me through the mud for some of the weird aspects of these characters, go right ahead, give me $5, I dare you. As for the eyes and mouths of the characters, I created a separate texture for each character's facial features and overlaid them on top of the character's diffuse maps with separate UV maps. I could animate these facial features using the UV warp modifier and control things like the mouths and eyes with bone drivers. Finally, it was time to animate our characters. Most of these characters don't really move around much in game, so I gave them a simple idle animation, and in order to push that stop motion feel on a pretty tight deadline, I used the Blender plugin Stop-Mo to simulate stop motion animation even in a 60 FPS project. That process was the same for nearly every character, but how does this all contribute to simulating gameplay? Remember that rough cut of the trailer I talked about earlier? Well, on top of giving me an itemized list of tasks to stress over for the next month or so, it also gave me a solid reference for how Ness moves around and how other characters and enemies interact with him. I imported this video as a background image and parented it to the camera, so no matter what, my camera always had this video as a reference. I then brought Ness into the scene and parented the camera to Ness, so that he's always in the center of the screen like in the original game. There were a few moments where I broke that rule for cinematic effect, but I generally kept the camera locked to Ness for gameplay segments. I would then move Ness to the desired location and scale him and the camera accordingly to match the proportions of the original game. Then I would rotate Ness to face the direction he's about to walk in, place a keyframe, and then move ahead in the timeline until he switches direction. I'd then move Ness to the next location and rotate him to face the next direction, using constant interpolation for the rotation and vector keyframe handles for the location. This results in admittedly jumpy and snappy movements, but it matches the original game, and Nintendo even had similar controls for the Link's Awakening remake. Though I could definitely see a real EarthBound remake smoothing out the movement a bit, similar to other modern top-down Zeldas like A Link Between Worlds. I guess it's more of a preference thing, but I think it fits the stop-motion animation style I went for. Speaking of animation, I used the oft-forgotten NLA editor to control Ness's animations, using mostly a simple run animation over the course of each shot. Once I had essentially traced all the movement from the shot at hand, I would render the animation and replace the gameplay in Premiere with my new remake gameplay. Back in Blender, I'd adjust the offset value of the reference video and move Ness to the next location. If there were any other characters in the shot, I'd place them in their appropriate location and add their animations to the NLA editor, sometimes sequencing multiple animation actions, like with Porky busting into Ness's house. There were a few parts of the trailer where I broke protocol a bit and created more cinematic cutscenes akin to the Super Mario RPG remake from last year. With these, I made custom animations for Ness and other characters and played with the camera perspective a bit, like this scene where Ness, Porky, Picky, and Buzz encounter a Starman Jr. I also had to create a number of interiors for this project, like Ness's house, Liar Exaggerate's house, and the burger shop, among others I featured in the showcase portion of this video. These were kind of a breath of fresh air, as I had a lot more control over the lighting in each of these interiors and could more easily set certain moods, like with daylight streaming in through Liar's window, or the sconces illuminating Ness's living room at night. Creating all of these areas and characters on the fly still made me feel a little bit like Gromit on the train tracks, but it was a lot more manageable than making a whole ass game from scratch. Before I wrap up this pretty long video, I wanted to dive into the process of creating the battle scenes shown in the trailer. First and foremost, I created models of each enemy, like with the NPCs, and gave them animations not only for the battle scenes, but also for their overworld interactions. All of the battle scenes were edited together in Premiere, so I had to render each animation as a PNG sequence in Blender. With these image sequences, I was able to import them into Premiere and place them on the timeline. For the backgrounds, I used a website called EarthBound Battle Backgrounds by Garen Tarikian, which emulates the system used in the original game to generate unique battle backgrounds for each enemy type. You can layer any two background components, and there's a list of presets for a bunch of the game's enemies. This tool was very useful, and I want to thank those who worked on it. It was really helpful for this very specific purpose, so thanks. I screen recorded about 30 seconds of these backgrounds in full screen, and dragged that into the timeline as well. I kind of went through the same process as the other gameplay segments, using the actual battle gameplay as a reference for UI and enemy animations, using Premiere's built-in effects for things like enemies flashing when attacked, and drop shadows to separate enemies from the background. I also rendered a little animation of Ness peeking out from behind his status window as a bit of a nod to Mother 3 and a way to liven up the battle UI. All in all, I'm pretty proud of how these battle scenes turned out, and I think they really added to the authenticity of this remake. With all that said, thank you very much for sticking around to the end of the video. This project took a lot out of me, and I'm honestly pretty excited to see what's next for this channel. I've got a lot of videos planned, and the next remake project should be a couple of months off, so stick around for that. If you enjoyed this video, please leave a like, leave a comment, share it with your EarthBound loving friends, hit subscribe to see more videos like this. I have more remake videos that I made last year, like I mentioned. I also have a second channel called kaggyzone, that's what it's called kaggyzone. Where I do gaming content with my friends. We played Half-Life dressed up as monkeys. It's a good time, you should go check it out. Especially as the Switch 2 news cycle sort of starts to kick off. I'm going to be uploading a lot more on there, talking about the next Nintendo console. I think it's going to be pretty fun, so definitely check that out. Once again, if you'd like to support me, I recently opened up my Patreon. You can get access to 3D project files and all sorts of screenshots and updates and behind-the-scenes materials. There's a lot that's going to be up there, so please check that out if you're interested, and your support would mean the world. My ultimate goal is to do this kind of thing full-time, and your support would really help me get to that goal. I love you. So yeah, with all that said, I haven't slept in 5 months, so I'm about to go take a massive nap, and I will see you in the next video. Good night!